Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced from alexmercedcoder.com. And what I want to do today is go over this JavaScript framework that I'm learning called FoalTS. TS meaning for TypeScript. So this is actually a TypeScript-centered framework. So there's really two main TypeScript-centered frameworks. There's Nest.js, which is a much more sort of built to kind of work with Angular. And it's said to have a much more of a learning curve. And then there's FoalTS, which I started learning, which is a little bit more agnostic regarding sort of what you use for your front end, but also basically creates itself around TypeScript. And the benefit of using something like FoalTS or one of the more robust JavaScript frameworks like a Nest or an Adonis, whatnot, is that a lot of the things that you would normally have to figure out how you're going to do it are built in. So basically, if you're using like Express or Koa, basically the core Express or Koa framework really just provides you with some basic routing and HTTP handling. So how are you going to handle sessions? There's several different plugins you can choose from. How are you going to handle authentication? There's several different plugins you can choose from, encryption, etc. Well, that's nice to have that flexibility. It also can be more time consuming having to figure out what's the best way and having to build out all that boilerplate every time. So frameworks so for Python like Django, and in this case for JavaScript FoalTS, what they do is they kind of build that workflow into you. So you still have to create authentication and do all the stuff, but there's a workflow that kind of saves you a lot of time once you learn it. The catch-22 is the learning curve is steeper, because when you learn Express, which generally pretty much every back-end JavaScript developer knows, it doesn't take that long to learn Express. It's basically you learn how to make routes, and then afterwards you learn, but you don't realize you still have the same learning curve. It's just that you're learning different technologies. So learning Express is really easy because Express is for the most part just the routing, and then you'll get a plugin for sessions, you'll use bcrypt for, like, let's say encryption, and then you learn how to use those things. So you think of it as kind of like learning something else. Well, something like FoalTS has it all kind of wrapped in a bow, so you're kind of like learning the whole thing in one package. Okay, but basically, this is a website, FoalTS.org, and really simple to get started with. So just like kind of any other npm package, just a few commands to get access to the CLI that lets you create new applications. What I'm going to do in this video is I did do the first tutorial in creating sort of a back-end to-dos application, and I'm just going to kind of walk through the workflow and the setup of the files. And in the future we'll do some more advanced tutorials as I get more acclimated with it myself. But when I looked online, I really saw like no video content on this. It's pretty new, so I figured it'd be nice for people who are interested in learning it to have a video so they can kind of see what this is about. Okay, and the documentation is really good, and I was reading through all of it yesterday, and I'm pretty excited about learning this. So let's go over here. Let's take a look for my FoalTS folder. Here's the to-do app. Okay, so basically this is kind of what you start up with. Okay, you have your build folder. Okay, that's where things end up when you build them. We'll come back to that. Your config folder with your configs. I'm not going to get into that now, but you do have some like JSON files for configurations for different environments. So basically here you can set up your variables for development. Here's your variables for production. Your node modules folder, which again is standard to any node project. Your public folder, which is basically your public folder. It's the folder that basically all your static files are in, and it's treated as sort of your root directory. So if you use Express, because this is built in, FoalTS is built on Express, so a lot of how things are done are going to seem familiar because Express is at the core of FoalTS, and it's adding and building upon all these other sort of really standard technologies to create one sort of holistic framework. So there's your index.html, which right now really doesn't have anything because I haven't really done the front end of this application yet. And then here's your source code where you're going to be doing most of your work. Okay. And basically you have three, here you have end-to-end testing, which again is for testing, but I'm not going to get into that. Here you have three folders. Here's your app folder where all your app logic is. You have your migrations, which we'll get into in a minute. So if you work with Django, you probably are familiar with like migrations in the sense that like anytime you kind of make changes to how your database is going to work, to sort of the underlying backend structure of your application. Instead of you having to go manually like recreate your database to match it or whatnot, you can run migrations and it just kind of coordinates that for you. So you have that capability here in FoalTS as well. And then you have scripts. This is where you would create scripts to create command line arguments. So if you want to create like a command line app or add command line functionality to your app, it has tools for building out those scripts, which is over here. Okay. Then here we have a couple files, and next, so just see here if there's anything particularly mentioned out. Here's technically where the server is set up. So if you wanted to change the port, you would just do that there. Okay, now by default, like Django, FoalTS will work with SQLite. Okay, and the reason it does that is that SQLite is a database that doesn't require you to install, like, you don't have to install MySQL, you don't have to install Mongo on your local environment to have a database. It creates just a database that's local to your project. So that's what this db.sqlite3 is. It's the actual database. Now, it's really easy to use another database if you want. You just change the proper configs. It's in the documentation, and you can work with Mongo, whatnot, MySQL, but it does have default SQLite functionality. So if you're not very familiar with all the different databases yet, it'll just generate you an SQLite database to work with and get to work. Okay, and then technically here's where you would configure that database in this ORM config JavaScript, because what it uses is something, a plugin called Typescript, which is sort of a standard interface between databases. What Typescript does is it's going to allow you to define your database models, so like your tables and your different fields, which you then migrate. Cool. So now we can start exploring the source folder. So again, here we have your app folder, and you have a couple different things here. You have controllers. Controllers are basically what controls your URLs. Okay, everything kind of starts off with this. There's an app controller, but I think that's over here. Yep. So this is your main controller. Okay, and this is basically the setup for a controller. So basically, if you use Express, your controllers are generally like individual functions. Here, you create like an app controller class. So here's your master app controller class, which manages all your URLs. Now you may want to have, kind of like in Express, you would create like a controller that manages a certain like route. So you can do that here. They'd be called subcontrollers. Okay. So here we're saying, hey, we have the subcontroller for any route that starts with /API. And if someone puts in a URL that is like your root /API, please go refer to this API controller for what to do. And where did we get that from? Well, we imported it up here. Okay, so we see it's inside that .controllers file. So here's API controller with all our routes for that API endpoint. Okay, there's a bunch of stuff you import from full core and Typescript up here. So basically what's going here's we're importing what we need from Typescript. Let's see how many of these I am already familiar with. Well, these are just HTTP responses. So basically, generally when you do, unlike Express, where you have the kind of like the request and response as parameters to the route, here you have context, which is going to be sort of your request parameter, which does get passed through to the route. Okay, which you see here. So here's, I think this is the post route. So the way the route gets defined is through a decorator, a TypeScript decorator. So saying, hey, this is a route /to-do. So since this is a subcontroller of the API and route, which we saw over here, the URL would be root /API /to-dos. That would be the URL. And if you're making a post request to that URL, you're going to do the stuff below it. Here's another decorator for validate body. So this is kind of similar to like using like schemas and Mongoose, where basically you're saying, hey, you know what? If someone makes a request to this route, make sure that this is true. Okay, and if there's anything that doesn't, basically it's a filter. Make sure the only information that you really want to receive is being received. Okay, so basically saying, hey, any additional properties that I don't define below, don't take them. Okay, and all we're expecting really is a variable called text that's a type string. And that variable is required, and we're expecting to be receiving the information in an object. That's essentially what that's saying. And then here's the actual function that these decorators apply to, which are generally async functions. So this is just saying, okay, the function is called post_to_do, which is, since this decorator is above it, it's going to apply to this route. So it's going to say, hey, when this URL gets kicked in and it's validated, run this route. And we're going to have a variable called context, and this is Typescript. Remember that. So you have to define all your types. So we're saying, hey, this context parameter we're passing in is of type context, which is a custom type built in the Foal, which really represents your request object and a few other things. So essentially it has your normal request object that you're used to from React, plus some other things. So basically you would access it just like this. So usually like not in React, in Express, you would say like request.body. Here you're just going to say context.request.body, because that request object is one of 4 different objects that are in that context. But otherwise, like Express, that's how that works. So we can go request the body. Same thing with like any param. So if you had to use, like here we have URL parameters, just like Express, request.params, except again it's an object within your context. So it's context.request.params. Yeah, cool. And right now this is just an API, so it's not pointing to any pages. We'll talk about like managing your front end later on. Even though probably this is a better way to just create your API than just make API calls from your application in your public folder. Okay, and then your response is handled through making a return of one of these objects. So here, like if there's an error, response not found. Okay, here's another possible, like HTTP response, there's no content, so it's just saying, hey, everything's fine, but there's just no further content other than what's already been received. Because it's just deleting, so it goes out and deletes it and just says, hey, we're done, but there's no content, so it returns no content. So there's a bunch of these which you see imported over here. Okay, and that's how the controllers work. Sounds a little complicated at first, but again, your built in is your validation. There's a bunch of other tools in that context object that are really useful. That's in the documentation. It's cool. So that's the controllers folder. Then you have the entities folder. This is essentially your models. So if you worked with like Mongoose and Mongo, which you could with Full, okay, you would just not be using TypeORM. Entities are like your schemas. Okay, they are sort of your models. So what would happen is that in the CLI, and for most of these files, you can use the CLI to actually create like a new entity or a new migration or a new build. Just to kind of go to the package.json file here, there are a lot of commands you can run. Okay, so build app, to do a test, really to develop is so you can start running your development server, build migrations, generate a migration, run a migration. There's a lot to use here, which means there is a little bit of a learning curve. But again, the point of this video is to kind of help you understand the structure, so that way if you decide to learn it, you'll have a good idea of kind of what things are conceptually to make it easier to learn. Okay, back to entities. So in this case, we created a to-do. So we have 2 entities here, to-do entity, which again, just so basically what we do here is we have a decorator define that anything below is an entity. This is our, we have to again import those tools from the TypeORM package, which is included when you create a FoalTS project. And basically you just use decorators to define your different things. So here's our basically our primary key, so our primary generated column, which is an ID. So the title is ID and is of type number, because again this is TypeScript, so we have to type everything. And again, the benefit of typing is that one, you can easier control the information that goes in and out of different parts of your code, versus JavaScript, which has dynamic typing. So here you can actually just sit there and say, hey, and while having to name a number may not seem super useful, and say, hey, this is a number, it's like, it's obvious, I'm going to store a number in there. When you start creating like complex objects, so kind of like that context object, you can actually create types in TypeScript and say, hey, this is supposed to look like this, which helps you catch bugs when you're moving information around. So it's just useful. it'll make you a more disciplined programmer, getting used to using TypeScript. And has a lot of really cool features for just sort of, again, managing bugs. Okay, and then plus you got decorators, and decorators are neat. Okay, so you have this decorator that basically says anything here below is an entity. You have this decorator that basically says anything below here is the primary key. And then this @column decorator basically says anything below it here is another field. So this is just another column in our table. Okay. So, yeah. And then you can just define all the columns you want with the types that you want, and then you would migrate it. And then here's one for user. Same idea. Right now it's just an ID number. Okay. And then here in your index.ts, you would import your different entities, and you would run the migration scripts, which read the documentation. I'll give you the exact steps. There's a couple steps. First, you have to like build the migration, and then you run the migration. Because first, you're gonna basically what's gonna happen is that FoalTS is gonna go through your files, pick up on your changes to your models, your entities, create a migration file, and then when you run the migration file, it goes to your database and then applies those changes. Actually, let's go through migration. So basically, what happens is that when you build your migration, it creates a file like this. And basically, what this file is saying is that these are the changes we're adding, and these are the changes stuff we're taking out. So up and down. Okay. This you generally don't need to touch. This is automatically generated when you run the build migration script. But that's basically what this is saying. Like this is basically a bunch of SQL commands making the changes to the database that need to be made. So that way it matches your entities. So that way when you run your code, it works just the way you designed it. Cool. Okay, and same thing with scripts. You can actually run a CLI command to create a script, run a script. So we created one script here, and this is just basically a script so that way we can test out the API from the command line. So that way you can create a to-do, add a to-do, that kind of thing. So basically how this works, again, you import some stuff, you actually create a schema. So in this case, we created a schema just to make sure that the information that we pull in from the command line is what we want to be putting into our database. Okay, this function just creates a connection to the database when they run the command. Okay, and then again, args is just basically anything you type after your command in the command line. So basically, if I write create to do and then I write something else, the arguments are the next thing that's after the next space. Okay, and that just basically says, basically we're gonna say, hey, we're gonna make a new to-do item based on our, and again, a new to-do based on the entity we created, so it knows it's in the database. And the to-do text, the text field, because we know the field is defined in our entity, so the text of this to-do is going to equal the argument text. And again, we created the new database entry when we did this. Okay, so we're creating this new to-do objects. We're defining the to-do object. Okay, and then we're going to console the log. Here we're saving it, so we're saying, hey, you know what? Save what we just changed. So connection manager, save the to-do we just created. And then we're console logging it, just the result. And then we're closing the connection when the script closes. Okay, and now I can go to the command line and create a to-do. Cool. And then they have one for create user, but it's the same idea. So now let's go to hooks and services. Now I don't have any hooks and services in this project, but you can kind of think of them as like middleware. They just kind of add functionality to your routes and entities. So there's nothing really in there right now. But let's take a look at the FoalTS documentation. Because after that, you've pretty much gone over the sort of the core what FoalTS is. It's really the hooks, the migrations, the services, and the controllers. That's really sort of what Foal's packaging for you. I mean, it has a lot of built-in Again, using entities and the validation decorator, you can make sure that all the data is going in and out the way you want it to. It has built-in support for like JSON Web Token and session management. You can TypeORM has the ability to work with pretty much any kind of database, so you have that kind of functionality right out of the box. So which is all really nice. So let's talk about services. So let's let that load up. Okay. So essentially the way this works here, so you can look at this code here, what happens here is you defined a class that does a thing. Okay, so here's our class, logger, and it has a function called log, which logs a date and a message. Now what happens is by creating this decorator dependency inside your app controller, so here's our main controller, basically what it's saying is that an instance of this class is just automatically existing inside this app controller that can now be used anywhere. So you can create this class, this object that has all sorts of functions that may be useful, in this case for logging dates and times of where certain things happen. You just sit there and you just create it as a dependency in your controller, and it's now accessible in all your routes. So here we can say, hey, this .log index has been called. So just, it's dependency injection. It puts something that you could use and injects it in there. Okay, so that's it for services. That's all that is. You create a tool as a class and you inject it in there, and now you have access to it within your controllers. Now hooks, and again you have command line tools for all this stuff, and it has a bunch of built-in hooks. Okay, so these are oftentimes more added onto your routes versus being added onto your controller. Okay, I guess that's one way to think about the difference. But let's take a look at an example. Okay, in this case, in this one they apply to the whole controller. So basically, to access any of these routes, you need to have your JSON Web Token. That's basically what that's saying. So this hook is saying anything below it is going to be checked to see if the person who's accessing it or the requester has their JSON Web Token configured on their computer that matches all the settings that are in the backend. And how you configure JSON Web Token, it's in the documentation. It's built in. So you can change your secret and all that kind of stuff. Okay. And you can build custom hooks. So here's an example. Let's see how they defined it. Let's see here. To create one, you just need to call the hook function. Okay, so here they're defining it as a hook. And the hook's just console log receive and get request. Good. So you're just defining the hook in the route. Okay. That's pretty much the main gist of it. There's a lot of other cool stuff you can use here, information about how to deploy, whatnot, but basically this should give you an idea of how to get started, how the workflow basically. Again, you build your backend by building out your controllers, you create your models by using your entities, and then hooks and services can help manage some of the other tasks, kind of like middleware for your controllers. So this is FoalTS. I think it's pretty exciting, a nice mix of TypeScript with a very robust JavaScript framework. Have a great day and enjoy. Oh, and before we go, okay, make sure to go check out my website. Yes, alexmercedcoder.com. Now at alexmercedcoder.com, you can find my YouTube channel, so you can find all my other videos on really cool stuff. You can find my Medium articles, and you can go join my developer networking Slack, where you can meet other developers, share your portfolio, do bug hunting, find people to work with for projects, all sorts of really cool stuff. And if you're looking to hire me, you can find my portfolio. Okay? So otherwise, I'll see you guys in the next video. Have a great day.